Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Simply Trade News Roundup. Today is a special episode, as it is every week, I feel like, and I say that all the time. But today is a special episode because there's been a lot of drama going on behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, really, because we see it everywhere. And I have a special guest with me that can talk on those happenings currently. It is Erik Smithweiss from GDLSK, partner at GDLSK. He's based in California, correct?
Correct.
So, hi, Erik. Nice to have you here.
Hi, Annik. Thank you for having me.
I was actually thinking about getting Renee on here too, because I know you guys know each other, went surfing together, I think.
Yes, we have gone surfing together up at Sunset.
Wow, beautiful. But we're not talking about surfing, unfortunately. We're also not talking about Justin Bieber releasing a new album. That's also not what we're talking about. We're also not talking about Love Island today. We're talking about trade today because I think about all these other things, but we're here for trade, fortunately. So there's a lot happening right now. So Trump has made a lot of corrections. He's made a lot of additional tariffs, and he's changed some things up that have not been in effect yet. They are going into effect August 1st. But let's talk about what has been done this week. So this week, there was a new additional tariff set for different countries, such as Japan, South Korea, South Africa, Malaysia. I mean, I could go on. The list is, I think there's like 14 countries which he sent letters to. How has that impacted, or have companies been, confused, or have they been trying to look at their supply chains, or is that affecting anything in specific?
Well, Annik, with our tariff environment and its tremendous uncertainty, one of the fundamental problems companies have is the lack of certainty and how best to plan and strategize for tariffs that are changing. So, what happened on July 7th and 8th is when this started, just before the July 9th day. So on July 9th, the high reciprocal tariffs for approximately 60 countries were supposed to go back into effect. China delayed until August. And those were also part to roll back out. That was, if you remember, from Liberation Day. The president had its charts out on the White House lawn, and it had a country and it had a percentage duty rate. And for those 60 great offenders, those would be the new rates starting July 9th. That got paused. That was supposed to go into effect on April 10th. It got paused until July 9th. And then leading up to July 9th, there was an effort to reach certain concrete trade deals. And so one was reached with the United Kingdom that maintained a 10% ad valorem rate across the board. Now, remember, these tariffs that are being imposed, if you will, under this emergency statute called the IEEPA, as it's known by its acronym, are in addition to any other tariff. So all the regular duty rates have, remained in effect, and these are sort of these emergency tariffs. So UK got a deal. Negotiations were ongoing with other countries. There's word of Vietnam having reached an agreement, but what I'm hearing in the media reports is not such an agreement quite yet. But in any event, so the administration, rather than triggering back the rates that would have gone into effect on July 9th. On July 7th, the president issued an executive order suspending all of those rates out until August 1st. So that was step one. So we do, by law, currently, the Liberation Day tariff rates are the rates that will go into effect on August 1. That's all that the executive orders have provided for. However, in the interim, starting a few days ago, the White House has sent letters, artfully drafted letters, out to various countries. And clearly the letters were meant for political public consumption and not actually for negotiation purposes. I'm sure the negotiations are going on behind the scenes, but, for the public we have these letters with their slight degree of dramatic use of capital letters and things of that nature. And so what these letters have said is your rate is going to be the rate listed in this letter, not what was in the Liberation Day, April 5 pronouncement. Your new rate starting August 1st will be the rate in this letter unless some deal is reached beforehand. And that's kind of where we are today. So we've got letters went out to all these countries. I have the list here in front of me. Some of them have the same rate that they did on Liberation Day. Many of them have a rate that differs from Liberation Day. Some are higher, and in one case, significantly higher, and that's Brazil. And others are slightly lower. Why they are adjusting these slightly, quite frankly, I don't think anybody knows. I'm not so sure anyone in the White House knows. But in any event, the numbers are a little different. And those new numbers are the numbers that sound like they will go into effect on August 1, absent a trade deal being reached. And just to put the final point on this, it will require future executive orders to implement the new rates that are in the letters that went out in the last few days, because that has not been issued in an executive order.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. And that's something I think we talk a lot here on the podcast, is that we see so much, well, I say drama on the news and, on LinkedIn, and people are talking about it, but nothing is actually set in stone, and nothing is actually like fully being implemented just yet, because there's no official order yet. So in that sense, do you think people should be starting to prepare already for these kind of tariffs, or should they hold off? Because we don't know. I mean, this might not even get into effect. There's no official order.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Annik. And until there is an executive order setting an imposition, we don't know. What we do know is there is an executive order that says come August 1, all these rates will go back into effect, the previous rates. So if they're going to change, that will require yet another step. But what we do know is that come August 1, there is a legal mandate that these higher reciprocal tariffs, either from Liberation Day or if changed, the new rates will go in effect. And the rates that were announced in these letters, quite frankly, may very well change between now and August 1. But we do have a date of August 1. The president has stated that this is a firm date. There's going to be no more extensions. But the president has said that before. And obviously, there's a little bit of a meme on Wall Street about this, which we'll stay away from. Could have to do with a certain meal that one would eat on a Tuesday. And I think we have to see, but it's a challenge. Let me, if you will, I'll give you a short example, because you asked how are companies dealing with this. And this actually came up yesterday with a company wanting to source the main component of a product from Vietnam. And based upon historical interpretations in customs rulings, if you build the product, final assembly of the product in China, but using this major main component from another country like Vietnam, even though final assembly is in China, the country of origin would be Vietnam. And there are plenty of customs rulings which have reached similar conclusions, that although final assembly of an article is in China, country of origin is another country because of the main component was not substantially transformed. And so what that would normally result in is that when that product comes from China as an imported, it will get assessed a rate of duty applicable to, for example, Vietnam or whatever else is the country of origin. But what we're hearing about this Vietnam deal, which I'm not so sure is really a deal yet, is that for Vietnam, it'll be a 20% tariff, but if the goods are Chinese and are transshipped, and that was the word used, it'll be a 40% tariff. Well, nobody knows what this transshipment concept is even about. Does it mean Chinese country of origin goods literally circumventing through Vietnam? Does it mean a product made in Vietnam with a lot of Chinese content? Nobody knows. So what I had to explain to a client yesterday is, yes, they can change their manufacturing scenario and they can assemble in China using this main component from Vietnam And Vietnam will be the country of origin for your regular MFN tariffs. It'll be the country of origin for your China 301 tariffs. But I can't tell you what actual final duty rate you're going to pay under the IEEPA tariffs. I don't know. I mean, presumably, if it's Vietnam, you'll pay the 20% Vietnam, but you may be getting assessed China rates on all the Chinese content. Nobody knows yet because the goalposts keep moving. And that's one of the challenges, is that with these emergency tariffs, the president has tremendous leeway to make up the rules as we go along. And as a legal advisor, it's a real challenge to advise clients on what will be their business certainty when the administration can simply issue an executive order and make up a new rule. And they can do that tomorrow, and they've done it many times so far.
Yeah. And that means for companies to get into some serious trouble if they do not do it correctly or, pay the tariffs correctly. But it's also, it's funny because there's nothing you can do. You only know that much. So what do they do? Ultimately, let's say they do, and this is weighing a little bit away from the conversation, but what if they, do put a certain rate and they pay their tariffs, whatever, but they're doing it wrong because no one really knows how to do it correctly. Could they be penalized for that, or how does that work at the end of the day?
Yeah, well, there's a broad spectrum of potential, enforcement actions from U.S. Customs. I would say, generally speaking, honest mistakes, just getting it wrong, but trying to get it right, usually result in just a company being assessed additional duties. But it's going to become increasingly important, and it is increasingly important for companies to actually document their reasonable care or due diligence when reaching a decision that's not crystal clear black and white. Because if there is a challenge from U.S. Customs and there is an assessment of duties, the enforcement meter is very high with U.S. Customs right now. And companies may need to be able to document that they actually carefully considered this. They sought outside advice. They got an opinion. Now, maybe the opinion was like, we're not really sure, but this is a reasonable interpretation. That could be enough to protect the company from penalties. Companies that make mistakes and declare their goods incorrectly, whether that's wrong country of origin, the more challenging issue is the valuation of steel and aluminum. That is a whole area of uncertainty. And I can tell you that there are companies on all sides of the spectrum on how they are calculating steel or aluminum content, some more aggressively than others. But that's an area where we are anticipating significant penalty action by companies that are perceived to be either obviously intentionally undervaluing their goods or being at least negligent about reaching a rational conclusion on how to do it. So we're in a era of heightened reasonable care, much more so than I've seen in the past.
Well, you brought up steel and aluminum, but what about copper now? Because I know he added 50%. So will that look like the steel and aluminum part, or will that look a little different? Because I know the steel and aluminum, it was craziness and is still, feared by a lot of businesses because they're not doing it correctly, or, they're just misunderstanding on how to do it. But with the 50% on copper, is that more straightforward, you think, or?
Well, we don't know yet because there's actually no legal notification. All we have are promises from the administration, but we don't have anything in writing. So in the steel and aluminum context, this comes up in the valuation and assessment of duty on so-called derivatives of steel and aluminum. And there was a major change back in early June with an executive order which said, as the steel and aluminum derivative list grew, the administration changed the rules yet again. And they said for articles classified in chapters 73 for steel or 76 for aluminum, prior to June 3rd, goods classified there paid the 25% steel and aluminum tariff on the full value of those articles. So there wasn't really any controversy, price paid or payable. It was simple. Starting on June 3rd, they changed the rules. They said they changed the rate to 50% and then said, well, you only have to pay the 50% on the value of the steel or aluminum content. You pay the lower reciprocal on the balance of the value. Well, there's a lot of confusion on how you determine steel and aluminum value versus the balance of the value. And that's an area fraught with a lot of both uncertainty and risk. We don't know what's going to happen with copper. It would not surprise me if we have a similar regime with copper, where bulk copper will get assessed on its full value, but items containing copper, there will be a list of derivatives, and you will be paying the 50% on the value of the copper in those. And you probably will end up with the same confusion over how the copper content is going to be valued.
It's funny because I'm sure like when the steel and aluminum went into effect, everyone that has copper in it are like, yeah, we're good. And now it doesn't look that way anymore. Okay, so there's another, well, I think that actually went out today was, and I don't think there's an executive order, like specific executive order or anything. It's just a letter. Again, how you said a letter. I liked how you said that it's mostly for consumers, as us, like for yeah. Because I thought, like, to be honest, when I saw those letters, I'm like, are they really getting those in the mail? Like, they definitely had a conversation about this. There's probably no letters actually being sent out. That's crazy. When he says that, I think it's so funny.
I have no doubt that the letter is actually being sent. My point is that the way the letter is written, it is written for political public consumption and not a serious negotiation between nation states. I mean, that's my perception, just the way they're written. I mean, there are grammatic errors everywhere, misuse of capitalization, but it's for a little bit of flair.
I mean, we read it on Truth Social first, I think. But so there was another letter sent today, and this is actually pretty interesting to me, is the Canada 35%, which obviously that's up for negotiation, nothing set in stone. But we've been back and forth with Canada and Mexico. People, obviously, we had a set tariff rate, and then he was like, no, USMCA will overwrite. So now we're back with 35%. Are those 35% going to go basically not to the base tariffs, but to tariffs that cannot be, jumped around with USMCA? What does that look like?
Well, I have the Canadian letter up in front of me, which is why I'm looking in this direction.
It's a nice letter.
Yes, all sorts of great capitalization in here. I mean, they're claiming it has to do with fentanyl, but then they're talking about unsustainable trade deficits. And then this thing about 400% tariffs on American dairy farmers, which, by the way, is not a completely truthful statement. There are very high rates on certain tariff rate quotas, but those quotas never fill, so those rates are never applied. So it's a bit of nonsense. Anyhow, the letter is silent, as far as I can see, as to the exemption for USMCA qualifying goods. But the proverbial word on the street, if you will, is that the exemption for USMCA qualifying goods will continue. So that, in effect, this letter is really more about a bit of drama, and it's changing the fentanyl rate for non-qualifying Canadian products from 25% to 35%. I mean, quite frankly, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes between the United States and Canada. I find it very surprising that this would have anything to do with fentanyl, which there is extremely limited amount coming across the border from Canada. But USMCA goods, from what we're hearing in media reports, should remain exempt from this slightly higher tariff.
Okay, and do you think there'll be more letters been sent out? Just because to me it's weird. The countries that he's choosing to create new tariffs for are just weird. They're countries that we haven't heard of. I mean, just recently, because we've heard most of the things coming from Europe or the UK, or, you know, we have China. We don't have anything here about China. We don't have anything here about Mexico. Do you think those letters will still be sent out, or do you think that'll be topics that will still be talked about in the upcoming days?
Sure. Well, with the exception of Brazil, I believe, and I would need to validate this. So for the listeners, do not hold me to this 100%. But generally speaking, I believe these letters are going out to the countries that were originally going to have a reciprocal rate higher than 10%. In other words, countries that effective July 9th were supposed to have the Liberation Day tariff rates. Those are the countries that are getting the letters. Everybody else who was at 10 is remaining at 10. A point we're going to come back to in 1 minute. Brazil was originally at 10%, but apparently President Trump is very displeased by the way his, I don't know if it's friend, colleague, former President Bolsonaro is being treated. So the 50% tariff threat with Brazil is entirely political and motivated by retribution and nothing else, because we actually have a trade surplus with Brazil. And so it really makes no sense to be imposing higher tariffs, be that as may. We don't have China in here because China is already being taken care of through a separate agreement, and China's 10% rate lasts until mid-August. That's why China's not in here. Europe, the European Union, does have a 20% Liberation Day rate, but no letters have gone out to Europe yet, presumably because there's some negotiation that's going on, so they haven't bothered with a Europe letter. Though we've heard, I heard on the radio either this morning or last night that there might be a letter going out to the European Union shortly. So anyhow, the rationale behind these letters are these are all the countries that should have had a higher rate effective July 9th. And so this is the sort of the grace period up until August 1 for them to, get this sorted out.
Okay, yeah. So I think the main sectors here, well, what we've newly heard is copper, 50%, steel and aluminum still in effect. That's craziness, obviously, behind the scenes. We've seen brokers struggle with that as well. Automobiles. I'm trying to say it the German way. Tariffs, 25%. And then we have electric vehicles, which are just insanely tariff from 25% to 100%, depending on the product and timeline. So with all this information, and you obviously getting to speak with a lot of, businesses and probably them struggling in this industry, what are the main points you would try to highlight for them to look at, or like changing supply chains, or, I don't really know what else to do other than changing supply chains, really implementing a compliance program too, to make sure that you don't make these kind of mistakes, right? Because these kind of changes go in effect so fast that I feel like businesses have to switch up their entire way of doing things. From one day to the next to not get penalized.
Yeah, I would say, the real challenges here are that it's difficult to change supply chains immediately. Now, companies that have built a diverse supply chain and can source from different countries are going to be in a better position than ones that can't. But we can't change countries of origin because we don't know what the rates are going to be in these other countries unless we're going to go to a country that has some level of certainty. I think it's certain as anything could be with the Trump administration, that USMCA qualifying products from Canada and Mexico will continue to be exempt. I think there's a fair degree of certainty there. But again, who knows? But it's a challenging situation. I say you got to pay attention to what's going on in the news. We have to wait and see what the new rates are going to be for the August 1 countries. You need to be focused on customs valuation. And in all cases, particularly for the steel and aluminum and eventually copper, and do your best to manage the tariff craziness. There's only so much companies can do when, again, the proverbial goalposts keep moving.
Yeah, and I want to highlight documentation is what you what you did speak on. And I think that is a good point, that documentation is probably most valuable to these businesses, so they can back up, where it came from and how they move forward, and to kind of safeguard their entire business a little bit more. But I want to thank you so much for coming on, Erik. It's always great. Will you be at ICPA in the upcoming October?
You are very welcome for this. I'm not sure that I will be at the fall ICPA conference, but there are plenty of good conferences going on. And if I don't see you there, I will see you at another one.
Very true. Very true. I hope that Sarah will be going. My friend Sarah, who works with Erik. But again, thank you so much for coming on and giving your expertise in this craziness. I know there's a lot of unknown things that you can't even speak on either, because it's coming from the upper level. And firstly, we'll see that on Truth Social. So thank you again. And for the listeners, we will be back on Thursday with another episode. So today is Monday for you. And then I'll be back on Monday. All right. Well, have a great week. Thank you, Erik. And we will see you next week.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show, or would like to sponsor Simply Trade, or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only, and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.